Hello, welcome to Catholic Challenge. I'm your host, Luke Lancaster, the Director of Biblical Apologetics for the St. Peter Institute. And today we're going to be talking about relativism. It's a very common issue with our culture. And to talk about this, I brought in an expert, Dr. Francis Beckwith. Dr. Beckwith, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, thank you for coming with us. So Dr. Beckwith was the previous president of the Evangelical Theological Society. It was a very large organization, still around today, but he ended up stepping down when he reverted back to the Catholic Church. He's a professor of church-state relations at Baylor University and the co-author of a book titled Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Mid-Air. Alrighty, so the topic of relativism. A lot of people in today will try to emphasize to us that there's a truth for them and a truth for us. Right, that there's a difference between the two. There's no the truth in popular culture. There's no higher intuitive moral law that can be quoted that can apply to every single person on this earth. For them to claim that there is a definitive truth, such as marriage being between a man and a woman for all people, or that abortion is wrong for all people, will be considered intolerant, judgmental, and fundamentalist. So they think that we're imposing our reality on them and that this is wrong for us to do. That marriage is between one man and one woman for me, but not for you. Or abortion is wrong for me, but not for you. Right? For the relativist, we make up our own morality. You know, just as somebody might like chocolate, another person likes vanilla. I like abortion, you do not. I disagree with abortion, you do not. But we should all just get along and be friends. Right? So that's a very common objection today. When the Catholic Church is trying to proclaim truth to society, that is what our society responds with. And so this topic of relativism is really important for us to be able to answer adequately, and so that we can engage in dialogue with our brothers and sisters that really need to hear the truth. So, Dr. Beckwith, how do we respond to somebody that says there's no absolute truth, relativist?
Yeah, well, there's different types of relativism. So, most of the time when people talk about truth being relative, they usually are referring to moral questions, such as the ones that you've already raised. But the interesting thing, though, is that these sorts of appeals to relativism, or sort of one's subjective feelings, in a weird way, are used to try to justify beliefs that they actually believe are good. So think, for example, the issue of abortion. That's something that I've written a lot on over the years. I have defended the sanctity of life position. But if you asked, let's say, somebody who holds the view that, abortion is merely a matter of preference, if you ask them the question, well, if the unborn human being is in fact one of us, how does that differ? How does that make it any different than, let's say, engaging in acts that destroy life after birth? And so it turns out that in a lot of these issues, that I do agree that people do initially sound like they're relativists, but I do think at the end of the day that when you sort of peel the layers away, it turns out that they are actually defending what they believe is, in a sense, absolutely true, right? Now, of course, that raises the question, where do we actually disagree? And so on the issue of abortion, I would say what we disagree on is on the question of who really is a member of the human community and is entitled to the protections of our laws. And this is why people that defend abortion will sometimes say, well, the fetus is a human being but not a person. And what they're trying to do there is to kind of agree with the pro-lifer. It's wrong to kill persons without justification. Where they disagree is on the question of what counts as a person. So, so I think that I think initially most people are kind of surface relativists, but if you kind of press them on these questions, they will typically argue that their view is actually good, And I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it later on, but the issue of tolerance it kind of falls in line with this kind of reasoning.
Yeah, exactly. Tolerance, being able to just not trying to push your own views, but just accept the other person's views. But yeah, there is this sense of that nobody really acts like they truly are a relativist. And there's all types of arguments that can be made for just the fact that there is, in fact, objective truth. I mean, just the claim itself that there is no objective truth, like, is that an objective truth?
That's right, and that's why a lot of people who are moral relativists aren't relativists about everything, right? So they'll be relativists about morality, but not about, let's say, science or something, akin to that. Let's say the kind of evidence that one is proposed in a court of law. So although, having said that, it turns out there are people that in fact do challenge the idea that there's such a thing as objective truth. And of course, the problem is that they're assuming that their account of reality, namely that there is no objective truth, is in fact the correct one, right? Which puts them in precisely the same position of anybody else who believes that they're right and someone else is wrong. So there is a sense in which you really can't be a consistent relativist about everything, right? Without at some point claiming to have the correct view.
Yeah, exactly. So the fact that another person says that, like, oh, we're just being intolerant. No, the issue is more so that they just disagree with us, and they're trying to just kind of cloak it over, like, oh, that's your truth, that's my truth, and everything is, separate like that.
Yeah, think about, you brought up the issue of tolerance. The question that I sometimes raise with my students, because we go over this I teach a course at Baylor called Contemporary Moral Problems, and I begin the semester going over moral reasoning and relativism. And so I ask my students, why do you think tolerance is a good thing? Because oftentimes I will get a little bit of pushback from my students in which they will argue that relativism is a way to ensure tolerance. Because they believe, as you've already said, that this claim that one is right and others wrong is a kind of oppressive, coercive way to think of other people's moral beliefs. But it turns out, though, their requirement that everyone ought to be tolerant does precisely the same thing, right? And they're saying that there is this moral principle that we ought to all abide by, and it's called tolerance. But then I ask them, well, why be tolerant? And we eventually get people in the class saying things like, well, if you're tolerant, you'll be able to maybe better understand other people. Really? You sound like that's a good thing. Or it sounds like you're saying that's a good thing. And what I point out is that if you're saying that, that means you're actually assuming something about human beings, namely that we are intelligent, rational creatures that have an obligation to act in a way that leads to our own flourishing. Well, that sounds an awful lot like moral objectivism. In addition to that, relativism actually doesn't at all lead to tolerance, or doesn't necessarily lead to tolerance. So imagine this. Imagine you convince somebody, I think relativism is correct. Or that, and then they say, you know what, because I think relativism is correct, I just want to force my views on other people because I don't care, right? So the point is that relativism doesn't at all necessarily lead to tolerance. You can, again, imagine sort of a tyrannical person just simply admitting it and then saying, okay, then so what? I'll just force my views on others.
Yeah, exactly. I think Thomas Aquinas had said this one quotation. It was that the existence of truth is self-evident, for whoever denies the existence of truth grants that truth does not exist. And if truth does not exist, then the proposition truth does not exist is true. And if there is anything true, there must be truth. So,
that's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's called self-refutation. And yeah, if somebody holds to a kind of absolutist relativism about knowledge and everything else, then they fall prey to this problem. I find it interesting, even in our public debates about very sensitive issues concerning race and gender and questions like that, in which on the one hand you find people suggesting that there really can't be any sort of objective history about how people have interacted with each other. But on the other hand, they will often cite history that I actually think is true history, in which people have in fact oppressed other people. So it's kind of this weird, I don't know how to explain it or to really account for it, this kind of inconsistency. On the one hand, there's a kind of appeal to the fact that there is no sort of objective perspective, and then on the other hand, they'll point out, look at all these atrocities in history. Well, that sounds like you're offering it as a kind of objective account of how human beings have treated each other badly, and I agree with you. But the problem is what you said earlier about relativism actually undercuts what you're trying to assert when you point to this history of oppression.
Yeah, exactly. So there really just can't be some type of floating around my truth or my subjective truth, because you're just like, it's so implied in our own language. It's so implied in everything that we do, everything that we say. And you said earlier about how nobody really contests science, that they accept that pretty much as objective. It's just these other like ethical questions that they try to say that there's no objectivity there.
Yeah, I do want to say something. You mentioned Aquinas. Aquinas does say something later in the Summa when talking about the natural law. And this is important, I think, for Catholics to know, because one of the difficulties I think that we have in the public square is that we offer our arguments and then we are shocked that people don't immediately accept them. And I think one reason for that, and Aquinas actually explains why, and he says everyone has a kind of awareness of the natural moral law, and this is of course what the Church teaches in the Catechism. On the other hand, though, there's another aspect to human beings. We're just not rational actors, we're also bodily beings, we're organisms, we're animals, and that means that sometimes the way in which we interpret the natural law is deeply influenced by our emotions, our culture, and our society. And so this is why, going back to the issue of abortion, you can see how people that are for the sanctity of life, like the Catholic Church, and people that are opposed to the sanctity of life, who support abortion rights, may very well have something more in common. Namely, they both agree that it's wrong to kill innocent persons without justification. Where they disagree is on what is a person. And I think this is important because it helps us better understand why people disagree. It's not always because they've heard our arguments and they simply reject them. It's that like all of us, they can be influenced by factors that are they're just not conspicuously aware of.
Yeah, and I know that there's also just the aspect of the fact that we sometimes, when some people try to claim relativism or say that that's my truth, that's your truth, sometimes what they're thinking is they're basically just trying to protect themselves so they don't have to change their own moral worldview. So they don't have to change their own perspective on some ethical question. Maybe they're happy with going with the culture in some area, or maybe they're happy with some sin, and so it's a lot easier to change our beliefs than our own behaviors.
Yeah, and sometimes it's people just don't like talking about these things. I mean, it is kind of uncomfortable, right? I think it's probably more so today than it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago, because you have now, several generations of young people and people that are entering their middle age that grew up in elementary and secondary school and now in colleges and universities, in which there is a kind of safety culture. And so they are told that feeling uncomfortable is always bad. And whereas some of us, and I think it's partly generational, it may be cultural as well, but some of us grew up in which we were told, actually, pursuing the truth can be really difficult and awkward and uncomfortable, and it's okay, you'll get through it. You know, so there's a completely different way of looking at the sort of the discomfort of difficult conversations that probably wasn't the case just maybe even a decade or two ago.
Yeah, I think also we were just so saturated before with maybe the thoughts of some of the Greek philosophers, you know, people like Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle, like they were totally comfortable with being extremely uncomfortable. You know, like they were totally comfortable with pushing on issues that everybody else was comfortable about, but they just wanted to know the truth. You know, we took an ethics class and Ave Maria and read that book by Aristotle called the Nicomachean Ethics, and he just goes through so much of all the different issues about ethics, like, is this wrong or is this right? And that's terribly uncomfortable for us to go through, but you know, he was able to do it, and he ended up pretty much arriving at a fairly natural law point of view, where he was pretty close to our own viewpoint of ethics because he was willing to go through that uncomfortability of thinking through whether or not it's all right or not.
That's right. And of course here, I mean, this is a nice moment to point out how Aristotle, because he was obviously a pagan philosopher who left with us much wisdom, but because he didn't have access to divine revelation, there are certain aspects of his thought that, as Aquinas himself points out, had to be completed by that which we cannot really arrive at by our natural reason alone. So the idea, for example, that human beings are by nature equal, Aristotle himself rejected that. He thought that there were kind of, certain human beings were born to be slaves, right? And what happens with the influence of Christian thought, and even in Aquinas, is the idea that human beings are made in the image of God is the ground of our equality. And Aquinas himself frames it as having this ability to reason and to know universals, which is something we share with the divine mind, and in that sense we're made in the image of God. Aristotle didn't have that belief, and so eventually, if you look at, for example, contemporary secular moral philosophers in the West, here I'm thinking about people like John Locke and John Rawls and others, they hold to this view of human equality. And my sense is that they would have never embraced that if they had not been deeply influenced by the Christian cultures in which they had grown up. And I think this is why you don't find outside of those societies influenced by the biblical tradition this view of equality. Now, have we always lived up to it? Of course not. But we've always had, though, this standard by which we could measure ourselves.
Yeah, and although Aristotle wasn't perfect, you know, like he definitely needed Christ and needed the supernatural revelation, he still was able to think through a lot of things just with natural theology, natural law, like St. Paul says in Romans chapter 1 about how the things about God's existence are just evident to all people. So many moral things are just evident to all people, like you shouldn't murder other people, or that there's just a certain amount of design throughout creation that signifies there's a creator. Like every person can know that, and that's just objectively within everybody's hearts, whether they fully accept that or not.
That's absolutely true. The one book that makes this argument quite well, that's pretty accessible, is by C.S. Lewis, the book Mere Christianity. In the first 5 chapters, he gives this moral argument for God, and then in his other book, The Abolition of Man, he actually, in the appendix to that book, he lists several different civilizations and their moral and legal rules about everything from marriage to murder. to theft. And one of the things that's astonishing is how much they have in common. And that's not surprising. If you think about the way in which human beings are ordered, that is to say, how we're designed, things like our understanding of parenthood and the responsibility of parents to children, our understanding of private property, our understanding of the wrongness of homicide, all these are so obvious universally that no matter what civilization you come across, you have rules about these things, about what you should and shouldn't do. Now, there are, of course, differences, but those differences can typically be accounted for by other factors. And it could be, in some cases, as Aquinas himself points out, you could actually have deeply corrupt people that in fact know the truth but have been so inculcated to behave opposed to that that they simply have a very difficult time doing what is virtuous.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we're going to go to a quick break, and we'll see you in a minute. Grace and peace. We're back to the Catholic Challenge. I'm your host, Luke Lancaster, and we're continuing our discussion about relativism. Those who say, there's my truth, and then there's your truth. There's no objective truth that applies to all people. We're with our guest, Dr. Francis Beckwith, who's a professor at Baylor University. So the last point that we mentioned was about pretty much multiculturalism. Basically, people in other cultures that whether they can recognize goodness or not, whether they can recognize the natural law or not, objective truth or not, and whether we should simply push them aside and say that they are, they have their own truths and we have our truths, or whether or not there is a natural law that we all kind of intuitively know. What are your thoughts on multiculturalism, Dr. Beckwith?
Yeah, so back in the 90s, there was this movement at universities to have a multicultural curriculum. Now, today, we don't really use that term multicultural as it was used in the 90s. Now you hear talk of diversity and equity and inclusion. What's really interesting is that when multiculturalism was being proposed, it was kind of proposed based on a kind of relativistic view of cultural differences. And one of the problems that I think people immediately recognized about this is that it, especially for those of us that are Christians and Catholics in particular, that within our own world, the Catholic world, we have a wide variety of Catholics all over the world, right? We have a global faith, one that can be found on every continent of the world, right? And of course, the Church has been able to, in its myriad of ways, to accommodate all those cultural differences. And so does multiculturalism prove relativism? Well, it kind of depends, right? If you look at multiculturalism as a way of thinking about cultural differences so that we can get to understand each other better and to appreciate those differences, and at the same time join people from other cultures in advancing the cause of justice and truth and beauty, that's not relativism. That is moral objectivism. So I think as Catholics, in fact, I think in some ways Catholics, especially in the United States, have a kind of distinct advantage in this regard. We have a much more global experience with people in our church that is probably lacking with a lot of Protestant denominations here in the States. So does it prove relativism? No, not in the slightest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there are so many cultures that have just come out throughout the entire world and history of the world, and all types of different places where they emphasize different things, or maybe they they do things that definitely don't align with Christianity, and then they do things that do align with Christianity. A lot of people in our society will try to say that, you know, all our cultures are equal, or we can't like judge another culture because, again, that just kind of underlying idea of their truth, our truth. But what Christianity has always done is incorporated the things that are good and pushed aside the things that are bad in every single culture. Things that can align with Christianity are kind of baptized, you know, like what Aquinas was doing with somebody that wasn't Christian, Aristotle. Things that were true that Aristotle said that aligned with Christianity, you know, were encouraged, and the things that did not align with Christianity, like his thoughts on the equality of man, they were pushed aside. So like, being able to recognize that there is, in fact, a moral law that is to be used and governed through all of the different cultures. That's the Christian truth, the new law by Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the two questions you have up on the slide, shouldn't we avoid judging other cultures? And the second question, aren't all culture, or the third question, aren't all cultures equal? I mean, it seems to me that the person that is, let's say, using those questions rhetorically, right? They're really saying we should avoid judging other cultures and all cultures are in fact equal. Those two comments are inconsistent, right? Because you can't say that all cultures are equal unless you've judged them all, right? So so that in itself is kind of incoherent, right? On the other hand, I think as Catholics we have to be really careful when we, let's say, encounter cultural forms that are not, let's say, obviously immoral or against the natural law, that just seems strange to us. And we have to really, I think, be sensitive not to issue harsh judgments, right? Or even judgments at all. So give you an example. When my wife and I spent a semester in Rome 6 years ago, we went to several Catholic parishes. In fact, when we would go to Mass every Sunday, we would choose a different local parish to attend because we wanted to sort of get to know the Romans. Well, the first Mass we went to, when it was communion, we, you know, very politely walked out of our pew as if there was going to be a ordered line to the communion rail. Well, it turned out people just rushed to the front. And I was sort of appalled by this. What are they doing? And as an American who was used to people lining up to communion in an orderly fashion, I immediately thought this was kind of rude. But then I realized, no, in a way, what they're doing is in honoring the Eucharist. They're so happy to want to receive it, they just rush up to the front. And so, you know, so there were things like that, and obviously other things that we have to be really careful not to confuse, let's say, the culture of our own nation with the with what the Catholic Church teaches, right? So I think that's just basic common sense. So I think there's something to learn from multiculturalism, but I don't think it's relativism. If anything, what the multicultural movement was suggesting, namely that we should, you know, be sensitive to cultural differences, is something a Catholic can applaud, but the relativism certainly not. And I even believe that the multiculturalists themselves weren't really relativist. I had a friend when I was teaching at UNLV in the 90s. She taught in sociology, and she was one of the architects of the university's multicultural affairs program, and we had lunch together, and I asked her if the university was going to celebrate cultures that treated women as if they were the property of their husbands. And she said no. And I said, well, then you don't believe that it is wrong to judge other cultures, right? So, I mean, I think that this is something that, like, you know, so I'm framing it this way because I think we have to, at every turn as Catholics, try our best to appropriate from, you know, secular movements those things that are good. And so, and again, you mentioned this earlier about how Aquinas appropriated Aristotle. I think there are, you know, that we can do that today as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think like it's just so common sense to us, like you said. It's like if there was a culture that maybe somewhere in the world they just enjoyed kicking puppies. I mean, like Americans would immediately like judge them for that. Yet that's totally inconsistent with the thought that they have their truth and we have our truth. Or I mean, just like September 11th, when that horrible catastrophe happened, nobody who might think that there's their truth and our truth would be able to go up to a child that lost his father during 9/11 and say, well, that wasn't really wrong. That was their truth. That was the extremists, the terrorists, and that we have our truth. We think it's wrong, but they thought it's okay, so we can't judge them. No, nobody thinks like that.
No, in fact, that's the beauty of what Aquinas says about the natural law, that we have these kind of natural inclinations. That is, they come out in these situations where we actually don't really deliberate too much, right? We get this visceral reaction to an injustice, right? We're moved by something that we see. Now, sometimes we could be wrong about those things, but the inclination is still there. And of course, people can be inculcated to resist those inclinations or to interpret them differently. So going back to the terrorists of 9/11, right? They had a belief that what they were doing was God's work, and they were willing to die for it. Now, within our tradition, we have martyrs, right? People that were unwilling to acquiesce to the state's demand that they deny Christ, right? They could have very easily avoided death by denying Christ, and yet we think what they did was noble. We don't believe that it would have been okay for them to, let's say, die at the supermarket because they didn't get the candy that they wanted or something like that, right? So there is a sense in which even the terrorists of 9/11, even though I agree totally what they did was horrific, terrible, but in a weird way, because they had accepted these beliefs about what they thought God was telling them, they suppressed the ordinary inclination not to take their own lives. Right? It's because they believed that there was a higher duty. Well, martyrs within the Catholic tradition believe they have a higher duty as well. Of course, the difference is they're actually not killing themselves, right? It is, in fact, the oppressor that's doing it.
Yeah, and also the not taking innocent life. Like it's just so ingrained into our thinking that is wrong. And no matter how much we might try to say that there's their truth or my truth, you just can't do that with something that horrific where somebody took innocent human lives.
That's right. And so it's interesting, though, if you listen to some of the extremists that defended the 9/11 attacks, they would say that there were no innocent lives, right? Because they believe that everybody who lives in this country, or at least our citizens, are culpable in some way for injustices done against them, right? So I don't think that's right, of course, but you understand what they're doing is they're rationalizing in order to be able to justify what they did. Again, this is actually an example of what Aquinas was telling us, right? The ability of the human mind to twist the facts because the human mind has the right moral inclinations, right? There's an old adage that vice is sometimes, what is it? I should have remembered. I should have begun saying it until I remembered it. But vice is the compliment that is a compliment paid to virtue. I forget. I messed it up. So there's a sense in which that even when we recognize vice, right? I mean, that assumes that we know what virtue is.
Yeah, exactly. I love how you pointed that out, that they were justifying their actions because they knew intuitively that it's wrong to take innocent lives. So what they did is they changed the difference there. They said these weren't innocent lives, right? They know it's wrong to take innocent lives. So if you say they were not innocent lives, then it's totally justified. But the problem there is a faulty line of thinking about that they were actually, guilty and deserved death.
So if you go back to the 19th century and you read attempted justifications of chattel slavery, the people that defend it had argued that, well, these descendants of Africans are not human beings. So they understood that it would have been wrong to actually own them if they were human beings.
Yeah.
So you see, even there, the attempt to justify it, in a sense, tells us what the real inclination is.
Yeah, I think there was also this this one story of how a professor came to Ave, I think it was J. Budjashevsky. He was a philosopher, and he was talking about how even, for example, the Nazis, when they were exterminating various groups of people, most notably the Jews, they would have fellow prisoners put the gas into the gas chambers because they just kind of knew intuitively, they didn't want the blood guilt. Right? They knew that something like that would be wrong, and so they had other people do it. It's like they didn't think that there was that it was justified necessarily to just kill people outright. They knew intuitively in their conscience there's something there that they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we're going to go to a quick break, and then we're going to come right back in, and we're going to jump into the topic of what Jesus said when he said, "Judge not, lest you be judged." Stay with us. We're back to the Catholic Challenge. I'm your host, Luke Lancaster, and we're talking about relativism with Dr. Francis Beckwith. The next topic that we were going to hop into was the topic of Jesus, how Jesus told his disciples to judge not, lest you be judged. A lot of people in our society love to quote that to Christians whenever Christians say that a certain action is wrong, or maybe a certain individual, like maybe Joe Biden and his encouragement for abortion. Like if somebody says, no, that's wrong, you shouldn't be doing that, they might come back to you immediately and say, well, didn't Jesus say, judge not, lest you be judged? What is the real meaning of that phrase, and how do we answer that claim? Are they right? Should we never condemn sin? Should we never condemn something that is against God's law ethically? What did Jesus mean by that?
Yeah, it's a couple of things to point out at first, and one of them is that the person who issues that claim is in fact making a judgment, right? So it's an odd thing to do, right? To tell somebody they shouldn't judge, in fact, is a judgment. So what did Jesus mean, right? I mean, in the same section of, I think it's from the book of, I think it may be, I don't know how many of the synoptics it's in.
I think it's in Luke.
But he actually does make judgments, right, about sin. I think that what Jesus is trying to say here is that we shouldn't be so quick to hold somebody to a harsh standard when in fact it could be used against us. So here, let me give you an example. Supposing you discovered that somebody, let's say, committed adultery, and you know that they know it's wrong, but they committed adultery, let's say, in a heat of passion. They were, let's say, distressed about some kind of family situation, and they know it's wrong. So instead of going to the person and talking to them and trying to restore them, you get on Twitter and you say, Fred's an adulterer, right? And I got the pictures to prove it. That's what I think Jesus is talking about.
Yeah.
I think that kind of thing. So he's not saying, don't make moral judgments, because the entire section of Scripture from which this comes includes a variety of moral judgments, but they're not individual judgments about individual people in a public setting. Now, there are times where that has to be done. I mean, there's no doubt about that. In fact, Jesus does talk about the person that sins against you, take them to the, take them aside, tell them privately, bring it to the church, and so forth. But here he's talking about, I think, just sort of the ordinary interaction with people that there's a tendency for our pride and self-righteousness to bleed in. And he's kind of telling us to not be that way. Yeah, yeah. Right? I mean, I think of my own experience in life. Like, I'm not a very patient driver. So, when people are going too slow or too fast, I get upset. And then about 6 years ago, when I had a detached retina surgery, and I had to drive for the first time after my detached retina, it began to heal, and I was so careful and slow, and I remember this guy beeping his horn, and I just thought, I got guilty, because I thought, that was me, right? So now when I drive, I think, maybe the guy that's going slow, maybe he just had a bad thing happen to him, or he's looking for an address. So I think that's what Jesus is talking about. Don't be so quick to employ a way of assessing another person that you don't want used against yourself. He's not saying don't engage in moral judgment. I mean, he wants us to be holy. He wants us to live a life for him consistent with the teachings of the church. But he's saying, though, that don't do it in a self-righteous way. Be merciful. Seek to reconcile people to the church.
Yeah, yeah. And I think also in that context, Jesus is saying how if you have a beam in your own eye, shouldn't you remove the beam before you see the speck in the other person's eye? He emphasizes the need to not be hypocritical judgers, right?
Yeah.
First, you have to, once you remove the beam, right, once you start living a holy life and you start, trying to follow Christ in every way possible, you have to humbly remove the beam, and then gently, with full knowledge of yourself and all the sins that you've had and the fact that you just had a beam removed out of your eye, then gently see the speck in your brother's eye and help him, right? I think St. Paul emphasizes that in Galatians 6 about how being gentle, like gently encouraging other people to avoid sin. Like when Jesus had met the woman in adultery, she was caught in adultery and everybody was just immediately like yelling and screaming at her. They were ready to stone her. But Jesus, emphasized the fact that we're all sinners and looks at her and says, my child, don't go and sin no more. It's such a gentle way of approaching sin, and I think that's the way we should look at that. But he didn't say to her, I don't judge you, period.
That's right.
He says, I don't judge you, go and sin no more, right?
That's right.
That gentle and humble way of approaching it, I think is so key, so key.
Yes, I think this is something to learn, especially in this this social media age where we are quick, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody, of quickly judging somebody based on some video or social media account of what happened. I think, for example, of those kids in Kentucky, I forget the name of the high school, but they were at the March for Life in, I think, 2018 or 2017, and immediately there was an encounter between one of the students and a Native American gentleman, and everybody interpreted as the kid trying to intimidate the older man, and it turned out that that wasn't the case. And several of my friends, some very famous Catholic intellectuals on Twitter, started condemning this kid because he went to this Catholic high school, and to their credit, after it was discovered that this was not an accurate portrayal of what happened, they apologized. But there's a lesson to be learned there. You know, do you want to be treated that way on social media yourself? Right?
Yeah.
You want people to, you know, take a pause, take a step back, wait for all the evidence to come in. Right? Now, you still may very well be guilty. Right? But you do want to make sure, and we've seen this not only in that case, but just hundreds of others, right? Somebody claims that a hate crime was committed, and turns out it was a hoax, right? I mean, this is just what our modern age is about. And so, if anything, we should learn from this passage of Scripture is that, because none of us want this to happen to us, is that, you know, just take a deep breath and wait till all the evidence is in.
Yeah, and just be deeply aware of your own sinfulness. Always, if you're really like reflecting on yourself and all the problems that you have and the beam that you have in your own eye, then absolutely you're going to approach every situation with a certain amount of gentleness and humility. And that's what Jesus was known for, and that's what Jesus wants us to be like, or to follow in his steps. Come follow me, to walk in the same steps of Christ. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So I really appreciate the show. I really appreciate you coming on, Dr. Beckwith. That was fantastic. It really helped us understand this whole notion of relativism, why this is such a problematic way of thinking. It's really contradictory. You know, nobody thinks this way in terms of other moral situations. It's really just that they believe that they're right and you're wrong, and not so much that there's no truth at all. So,
well, thank you, Luke.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, support me on Patreon, Luke Lancaster, and check out the St. Peter Institute, stpeterinstitute.com. And I'll see you again next week on Wednesday. We're going to be talking about contraception with Jackie Angel. And you, the listener, have a blessed rest of your night. Grace and peace. And I'll see you